So in continuing with our security-themed review of design, development, and testing, we want to explore a technique now known as code obfuscation. What this is meant to address is something that we just experienced. Is the reverse engineering of applications an issue? Yes, absolutely it is. We just saw that. Now, it can be easier on some platforms to reverse engineer an application back into the source code, but the problem is that it can still be done. What can we do to combat this? Well, this is something called code obfuscation, which means it is designed to take the code that you have written for your application and make it more difficult for a human being to understand. We'll give you some examples of this using JavaScript. Here, for example, is a standard block of JavaScript written as a developer would write it. We see comments in there, we see code structure, we see variable names that make sense for the values that they are meant to carry. These are all things that are there to make it very easy for your developers to understand the code that they are working with. That's a good thing. You want them to be able to understand the code. However, we do not want our attackers to be able to understand the code. So one very simple example of code obfuscation, particularly with JavaScript, is something called minification. We can take this block of code and minimize it. What we have done here is we have removed unnecessary white space, so we have destroyed that structure of the code. We have removed comments because they contribute nothing to the code execution, just to the understanding of the code, which is not something we want to give to our attackers. And we have renamed variables. No longer do they contain variable names that help describe what the value is that is contained within them. We've just given them random letter designations. Looking at this code, it's difficult to understand what exactly it is meant to do. It can be reversed engineered to a certain degree, but you will never be able to take a variable name that has been converted into, say, Q, and return it back into the error level that it was before. You simply won't be able to do that. Now, minifying is something that you can do with JavaScript, but it is certainly not the only option you have. Obfuscation can get much more complex. For example, we can do something called dead code injection. Now, what is this? This is inserting code into your application that will never be run. You can create functions or put lines of code inside conditional statements that will never execute, making a condition as simple as, say, if true equals false or if 1 equals 2. That is a block of code that will never execute because those things will never be equal to each other. However, after obfuscation, they've been modified so that it's not immediately obvious what it is that that code does. With dead code injection, what we are doing is we are causing our attacker to spend more time and resources on trying to understand a block of code that does absolutely nothing. It does not contribute to the program execution at all, and they will just waste their time trying to understand this useless code that we have put in there. Although that's not the end of it. We can make things much more difficult. For example, as you saw in the minified example of JavaScript, some of the strings, actual words that were said, they were still there. You could still read them. Well, we can actually represent letters in a different way. We can use things like hex escapes, hexadecimal representations of the Unicode or ASCII values of letters instead of the actual strings themselves. So again, if we were to return to this standard block of JavaScript and we were to really make it difficult to understand, that's going to take a considerable amount of time to understand what it does. However, the beauty of it is computers can execute it just the same. They interpret it just the way that it's meant to be run.